Okay, so why don't we go into ACI and start implementing this whole architecture. Let me open up ACI here. So I pretty much have a blank installation here. One thing that it is configured is the ASA cluster. As you can see here, I got the physical domains for the cluster control link and the actual data interfaces. And then I have a layer 3 a routed domain configured for the ASA. We're going to be establishing our OSPF adjacency through this to the actual ASA inside interface. So that's already pre-configured. So why don't we go in and why don't we prep our tenant common configuration. So why don't we go into tenant common and build that shared layer 3 out, and let's build that shared services. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create our VRFs. I already have a shared services VRF. Let's just delete it. And I have my internet VRF. We could delete that right now as well. All right. I'm also going to enable or turn on our show API inspector because I'm going to want to see kind of posts are being sent so that I could copy them later and then create scripts and automate this whole process in a matter of 2-3 minutes. Okay, so what do we need? We need to create our bridge domain, or actually we need to create our shared layer 3 out connection. But before we do a shared layer 3 out, we have to actually configure the fabric access policies. So we're going to start off with an AEP. So let's create an AEP. So let's just do an AEP 6500 shared L3 out. To create physical domain. Actually, let's do a layer 3 routed domain first. We're going to need to create the physical domain later for the actual customer routers. We're not going to need a VLAN pool, so we're just going to move forward. All right, so we got our AEP. We have our external routed domain. Here's our 6500 layer 3 connection. Let's create our policy groups. So we're not going to create a VPC. This is going to be a single connection, as I mentioned before. So we're just going to create a leaf access port policy group. So we are connecting the shared layer 3 out on the 6500 port G24. So we're just going to configure it as so. We're going to just put the port number here so I can easily remember what's going on later. Link level, these are already pre-configured from previous task. Let's just enable LDP and CDP, LDP and CDP. And we're not going to do any port channeling, obviously, so our AEP that we just created, here it is, shared layer 3 out, and let's submit that. Let's review that. Okay, now we got to create our profile. So let's call this interface profile 6500. It's going to be our L3 connection. Oops. And our interface selectors, we're going to be using port 3. And the policy group is the 6500 G24. So we're going to be connecting G24 on our 6500 router switch, and we're going to connect it into leaf 1 on port 13. All right, so now we've built that. Let's go into our switch policies. And we should have leaf 101, leaf 102 switch profiles for each of the leaf switches. And just to kind of show you what's going on here, we have our interface profile for our Cisco ASA, and then we have a port 9 configuration for our ESX VMM integration. So the 6500 is connecting on leaf 1 on port 13, so we're going to need to add our interface profile to leaf 1. And that's right here, this interface profile 6500 layer 3 connection. I'm going to submit that, and that should automatically establish that connectivity. Let's take a look here real quick. We're connecting on port 3. There we go. Took a little while. Port is down. Oh, it's clearing. Okay. So we should have the AEP applied to that port, and we should be in good shape. Okay, so let's go to our tenant, common. Now we have that 6500 connection applied. So if we go back here, we have this link now created into the 6500, to the ACI, actually into the ACI fabric, and we're going to use our layer 3 out to communicate over that link. Let's go back to tenant common, and let's create our shared layer 3 out. So here's our shared layer 3 out, and we're going to be doing BGP over it. We have to create a VRF. Let's see what the diagram was. We are using VRF internet. So let's create our VRF internet. And our external router domain, we're going to use the 6500 layer 3 connection that we just built. I'll just keep this default here for now. Let's call it node profile. We're going to need to create a loopback. So we're connecting on leaf switch 1. We're going to use the 10.1 IP address space, so let's do 10.1.1.254 as the loopback. Let's leave the BGP peer connectivity profiles till later, till after, because I want to modify it. I don't want to use the loopback. I want to use the actual physical interface for the peering. Alright, so we're going to use a routed interface. Again, it's going to be on leaf switch port 13. The IP addressing is going to be 227. Is going to be the layer 3 out. And let's create our external EPGs let's just call this external EPG1. Let's just bring a default route. Actually, we're going to be anything that's connecting in over this layer 3 out, we're going to basically treat it as an external EPG. Okay. Let's take a look at our configuration so far. No problems. We got to create our BGP peer connectivity. So I want to use the interface for the peering, and the IP address of the peer was 225, if I remember correctly. 10.1.1.225. Yep. We're using the remote AS was 65050. And our local AS was 65100. Okay, so that should have applied. So far, let's check. We should not have any errors. Nope. And let's check to see if we have a BGP peering. Oh, look, here it is. So 10.1.1.225, we already have an established connection. We're getting some routes. So we're getting a default route from the 6500 DMZ or 6500 core switch dash router slash router. We're getting the 97 address and the 96 address. These are actually just loopbacks for testing. Okay, so it looks like we have adjacency, so this is good. We have a peering. All right, so now let's create our shared services. So we're going to go in here. We're going to create a VRF. We're going to call it shared services. We're going to create the bridge domains later. This happens from time to time. Okay. And we're going to need to create a bridge domain for our shared services. So we just created our VRF shared services. We're going to create our bridge domain shared services and then our EPGs. We're going to put the bridge domain into the shared services VRF we just created. I'm going to hit next. And we're not going to create subnets on the bridge domain. We're going to put them actually under the EPG so that we can share the EPG. We can do some route leaking from the EPG out. So let's create an application profile. Let's call it shared services. AMP shared services. And let's create our EPGs. So we're going to create EPG backup and associate it to the shared services bridge domain. We're going to create EPG LDAP. Same thing. We're going to associate to the bridge domain. And we're going to create Epg DNS. Okay, let's give the EPGs their subnets. So I'm going to create a subnet for each of the EPGs. So we're on backup. Backup, if I remember, we were at 10.1.1.1/27. Let's do DNS. Actually, let's do LDAP next. 10.1.1.33/27. I think that's how I had it set up. And then lastly, the subnet for DNS. 10.1.1.65/27. All right, so we just created our shared services. Now, let's deploy these. So I already have a VMM domain association. I'm just going to deploy this so that we could push out these DNS port groups, a backup port group, and then we could assign them to our virtual machines, put IPs on our virtual machines, and they'll have connectivity out. All right, so let me establish connectivity for one of the EPGs so that they could actually reach the internet. Let's do it for DNS because we like DNS. So what we're going to need to do first is, because they're in different VRFs, and bridge domain is inside of VRF, we're going to need to create a contract, a tenant level contract that we're going to need to manipulate and leak the shared layer 3 route into the shared services VRF. So let's do that real quick. Let's go to security policies. Let's create a contract. Let's call it shared L3 out for the tenant, or actually let's do it for the VRF. And scope is going to be tenant because we're going to be doing it for tenant common for this particular one. As far as the contract subject, let's just keep it simple for now. We can change this later. Let's just do a permit all and select the default filter chain. Okay. Now I'm going to export this contract. I'm going to export it as shared L3 shared L3 out shared services, and we're going to export it back into tenant common. Okay, so now I created that contract. I'm going to add that contract to my DNS, so I'll test DNS. So we'll go to our DNS EPG here, and we're going to add the consume contract interface so that we can do a route leak. So here's the contract, shared layer 3 out, shared services. I'm going to submit it. This is consuming the actual contract, and now we have to provide the contract. So we're going to go to the shared layer 3 out. We're going to click on the external EPG, and we're going to make sure that we provide this contract. So we're going to go under contracts for that external EPG, and we're going to provide this contract. There you go. Now, along with this, I believe we have to make some changes. We're going to need to do a security import here. Okay. Let's look at our VMM integration real quick. All right, so we already have, like I mentioned before, a VMM integration. Here's our DNS server. Let's change the port group. We set up a port group, an EPG of shared of DNS, EPG DNS, in the shared services application network profile and tenant common. So we're going to select that. So we're basically putting this virtual machine into the DNS EPG. And let me just open the console here. Log in here. So we got to just change this IP address. So this was, actually this is not, this is correct. So we had the 10.1.64 subnet / 27. So this .70 falls within there. We should be in good shape. Oh, wait a minute, the net mask is wrong here. Because we're using a /27, so the net mask was wrong. So we're using a default gateway of 65. This should be the subnet defined on our EPG. Let me just restart this. All right, so we got default gateway connectivity. So we're pinging the subnet of our EPG. Let's see if we can ping, what was it? Oops. Let me go back here. What should we be able to have access to? '97. Let's try pinging 97. What's going on here? Typing. And we got connectivity. So our shared service DNS now has external access. We go back to the diagram. Our DNS service here, we have a host that's connected to that DNS service, and that host IP is what we just configured was 10.1.1.70, and it's a virtual machine. It already has access to something, the 977 subnet, or 977, it's actually a loopback address. That is sitting off of the 6500 router. Okay, so now we establish connectivity, and we know that if it works for DNS, it's going to work for backup and LDAP. So what we're going to want to do now is we're going to want to build the actual customer one tenant. We're going to want to build the ASA configuration and the WAN configuration. And once we get all that configured, we're going to then get the shared layer 3 out services deployed as well. Okay, so let's go and create our tenant. I'm going to call him customer 1. And first thing we need to do is build our VRFs. So we're going to have an internal VRF where all the bridge domains are going to reside in. And we're also going to need an outside VRF for where the firewall and the MPLS customer edge router is going to, the meet place, you could call it. Even though it's not going to provide any layer 3 services, but we need the actual logical construct. So we're going to create a bridge domain in EPG as a meet place. So it's just going to be called, let's just call it outside. And let's create our bridge domains. So we're going to have bridge domain prod web. We're going to put it into the customer one internal VRF. We're going to configure the default gateway on this. So we're going to just add a subnet here. And for the prod web, if I remember, we were using the 10.100.11 subnet. 97/27. Let's create the other ones as well. So prod DB. We're going to give it an IP address of 10.100.1.33/27. And we're going to create the dev web. We're also going to put it into the same VRF. And we're going to create dev DB in the same VRF. (97/27). Alright, so if we just take a look here, we have our development and our production bridge domains. And these bridge domains all have subnets defined or default gateways defined. So just gonna make sure here 97, 65 looks good, 33 looks good, and 1 looks good. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to create that application network profile. We're going to call it ANP